The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily since noon, a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on the Douglas firs surrounding my cabin. I stood on the covered porch, the raw wind carrying the scent of pulverized pine needles and ozone. Rain didn't just fall in Portland tonight. It assaulted the earth. The timber of the decking vibrated beneath my boots with the force of the downpour. I was adjusting the tension on the storm shutters, locking the heavy brass deadbolts into the frame, when the sweeping arc of headlights sliced through the deluge. A vehicle was taking the dirt access road entirely too fast for the mud conditions. I stopped moving, my hand still gripping the torque wrench. The car, a compact sedan clearly not built for off-road grades, skidded to a halt near the edge of my gravel drive. The driver's side door shoved open against the wind. She stepped out into the absolute chaos of the storm. It was Amelia. I recognized the sharp, determined line of her posture before I clearly saw her face. She didn't run for cover. She stood there in the headlights, the icy rain instantly plastering her thin white button-down shirt to her skin. Her dark hair was soaked flat against her cheeks, water streaming down her neck, rendering the fabric of her blouse nearly transparent against the dark silhouette of her bra beneath. She looked small against the backdrop of the roaring woods, but her chin was tilted up, defiant. She walked toward the porch, her boots crunching unevenly on the wet gravel. I stepped forward, the overhang of the roof shielding my dark canvas jacket, keeping my back to the blinding glare of her idling car. "Carter," she said. Her voice was barely audible over the drumming rain, shaking with a cold she was trying desperately to hide. "You shouldn't be driving in this," I said, my tone flat, assessing the immediate danger. I didn't ask why she was here. The white-knuckled grip she had on a soaked manila envelope told me everything I needed to know about the urgency. "My apartment," she started, her teeth chattering so hard the words fractured. "The studio. The lower level flooded. Sterling Management shut off the power to the whole grid and slapped an emergency vacate notice on the door. I had 10 minutes to grab my server backups." She was shivering violently now, her shoulders drawn up to her ears. The white shirt offered zero thermal protection. I felt a sudden sharp drop in my stomach, not panic, but a deep, immediate need to secure the perimeter, to secure her. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I stepped down one stair, reached out, and clamped my hand gently but firmly on her forearm. Her skin was like ice. "Inside. Now." I guided her out of the rain and into the mudroom. The sudden silence of the insulated cabin wrapped around us, thick and heavy. I let go of her arm immediately, taking a deliberate step back to give her space. The puddle forming around her boots was already staining the floorboards. "I didn't know where else to go," Amelia whispered, crossing her arms over her chest, suddenly hyper-aware of her soaked, clinging clothes. "Marcus said you lived up here. Said you wouldn't mind. I can sleep in the car. I just need to wait out the flash flood warnings." "You are not sleeping in a compact sedan in a temperature drop," I said. My voice was steady, dropping into the cadence I used over the radio when talking a stranded hiker off a ledge. I unzipped my heavy, fleece-lined canvas jacket and held it out. "Put this on. The core temperature drop is the first thing we need to arrest." She hesitated, her dark eyes scanning my face for pity. She wouldn't find any. I offered only logistics. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the knuckles of my hand, and pulled the jacket around her shoulders. It swallowed her entirely, the dark fabric hanging past her thighs. She exhaled a shaky breath, pulling the lapels tight together. I pretended not to notice how perfectly she fit inside my armor. "The envelope," I pointed to the sodden mess in her hand. "Set it on the counter. I'll get you dry clothes. The power grid up here is off-grid solar with a diesel backup. We have heat." "Thank you," she managed, her voice tight. I walked into the hallway, forcing my hands deep into my pockets. The distance was necessary. Amelia Daniels was 36, a brilliantly capable architect who had contracted my search and rescue team a month ago to survey a remote plot of land for a new eco-lodge. She was precise, fiercely independent, and completely out of my orbit. Seeing her stripped of her armor, shivering in my hallway, triggered a protective instinct I normally reserved for the job. But this felt entirely different. It felt personal. I returned with a stack of folded clothes, a clean gray thermal shirt, and thick sweatpants. I set them on the wooden bench beside her. "Bathroom is the first door on the left. The water is hot. Use it." She nodded, gathering the clothes. Before she turned down the hall, she looked back. "Carter, the notice they posted. It wasn't just a weather evacuation. It was a 30-day eviction notice under the guise of structural damage. They're using the storm to clear the building." The threat was concrete. Sterling management. I knew their tactics. I gave her a single nod. "Take the shower, Amelia. We'll dismantle their paperwork when you're warm." By the time she emerged, the storm had escalated. The wind howled against the A-frame, rattling the reinforced glass. I was in the kitchen, checking the voltage regulator on the battery bank monitor. "It's dropping," I muttered, tapping the digital gauge. The intake from the solar panels was 0, and the battery reserves were draining faster than they should. Amelia walked into the room, the sleeves of my thermal rolled up past her elbows. Her hair was wrapped in a towel. She looked softer, younger, without the sharp tailored suits she usually wore on site. "What's dropping?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "The voltage," I replied, grabbing a flashlight from the emergency kit on the wall. "The transfer switch didn't engage the diesel generator automatically. If I don't manually bypass the solenoid, we lose the radiant floor heating in about 20 minutes. "Can I help?" she asked, immediately stepping forward, her architect's brain pivoting to problem solving. "Stay here," I instructed, zipping up a waterproof shell over my shirt. "The generator shed is 30 yards back. The wind is currently gusting at 40 knots. It's not safe for you to be out there without proper traction gear." I didn't wait for her to argue. I stepped out the back door, instantly swallowed by the roaring dark. The rain felt like needles. I kept my center of gravity low, navigating the muddy path to the shed by memory. Inside, the smell of diesel and cold metal was familiar. I flicked the flashlight on, gripping it between my teeth, and opened the generator housing. The starter solenoid was jammed. I grabbed a pair of insulated pliers from the toolkit, bypassed the primary relay, and manually shorted the connection. The massive diesel engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life, violently shaking the shed floor. The green light on the transfer switch blinked steady. Power secured. When I walked back into the cabin, stripping off the dripping shell, the lights were burning bright and steady. Amelia was standing by the kitchen island, a mug of steaming tea in her hands. She looked at me, taking in my wet hair and mud-spattered boots. "You handled that quickly," she noted, a quiet respect in her tone. "It's just a bypass protocol," I said, wiping the rainwater from my face with a towel. "Nothing complicated." "To you, maybe," she said softly. She looked down at the mug. "I feel completely useless right now. I build structures for a living, and a little water sends my entire life into a tailspin." I stopped drying my hair and looked at her. The self-deprecation in her voice was a defense mechanism. "It wasn't a little water, Amelia. It was a localized flood coupled with a corporate trap. You secured your primary asset, your server backups, and you navigated a compromised road system to find high ground. That's not useless. That's survival logic." She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto mine. There was a sudden stillness in the room, the chaos of the storm entirely blocked out by the thick log walls. The physical act of holding her gaze felt heavy, grounding. I didn't offer her a platitude. I offered her a measurable fact. "Sit," I said, pointing to the sturdy oak table. "Let's look at that eviction notice." For the next 2 hours, the only sounds were the drumming of the rain and the rustle of damp paper. Amelia spread the documents out under the warm glow of the pendant light. I sat across from her, not beside her. I needed the physical boundary of the table. Clause 4B, she said, tracing a line of legal jargon with a perfectly manicured, though currently shaking, fingernail. It states that in the event of an act of God compromising structural integrity, the lease can be terminated with 30 days' notice to allow for critical repairs. Define critical repairs, I countered, leaning forward slightly. Did they have an independent structural engineer sign off on the damage assessment before posting the notice? Because under Oregon commercial lease law, a visual inspection by a property manager doesn't trigger Clause 4B. Amelia blinked, surprised. How do you know that? I run a search and rescue operation, I explained, keeping my tone even. Half my job is navigating liability, insurance clauses, and land use permits. If someone gets hurt on a rescue, the paperwork is thicker than the medical chart. Let me see the signature block. She slid the paper across the wood. Our fingers didn't touch, but the proximity of her hand sent a sudden, unwelcome tightness to my throat. I ignored it, focusing on the ink. It's signed by a regional manager, I said, tapping the paper, not a certified engineer. This isn't a legal eviction, Amelia. It's a scare tactic. They want you out so they can flip the building to the new high-rise developers. A breath shuddered out of her, a mix of relief and exhaustion. So, I have a fighting chance? We have a fighting chance, I corrected smoothly, not missing a beat. Tomorrow, when the road's clear, we file a motion for a temporary injunction based on lack of expert assessment. Until then, they can't touch your gear. She slumped back in her chair, closing her eyes. The tension that had been holding her spine rigid finally cracked. I don't know how to thank you, Carter. I really don't. I shouldn't be imposing on you like this. You have your own life. I'm 36 years old. I shouldn't need a 29-year-old rescue pilot to save me from a landlord. There it was. The age gap insecurity, the trust issue. She felt like a burden because society told her she should have it all figured out by now. I stood up from the table, taking her empty mug. Competence doesn't have an age requirement, Amelia. And requiring backup isn't a failure of independence. It's a logistical reality. I turned on the faucet, rinsing the ceramic. You're taking the guest room. The storm isn't breaking until tomorrow afternoon. We'll set a clear timeline then. I didn't wait for her to argue. I walked her to the spare room, handed her a set of heavy wool blankets, and stepped back out into the hall. Good night, Carter, she said quietly from the doorway. Door locks from the inside if you want it to, I replied, a strict adherence to making her feel secure. I'll be on the couch. I closed the door before she could see my hands clenching into fists at my sides. The discipline it took to walk away was a physical ache. The next 3 days became a study in forced proximity and rigid boundaries. The storm didn't break. It stalled over the valley, washing out the main access bridge to the county road. We were trapped in the cabin. We fell into a functional, quiet rhythm. I didn't crowd her. I woke up at 5, chopped wood, checked the weather bands on the ham radio, and cooked breakfast. Amelia took over the kitchen cleanup and spent hours on her laptop, using my satellite internet to compile her architectural portfolios and draft legal emails to her lawyer. I watched her work from the armchair by the fire. I watched the way she chewed on the end of her pen when she was frustrated. I watched the resilient line of her jaw. I wasn't looking at her body. I was observing her spirit. She was relentless. On Thursday afternoon, the cabin pressure shifted. The satellite internet went down due to heavy cloud cover. Amelia let out a frustrated sigh, pushing her laptop away. I need to send this injunction draft, she said, rubbing her temples. If the lawyer doesn't file it by Friday morning, Sterling Management can legally change the locks on Monday. I looked up from the topography map I was marking. The satellite dish on the roof is misaligned. The wind yesterday knocked it off its azimuth. Can we fix it? She asked, already standing up. I can fix it, I said, grabbing my climbing harness from the gear hook. The roof pitch is steep and slick with rain. You stay inside and monitor the router connection. When the light turns solid green, knock on the window. I stepped out onto the back deck, the icy rain immediately soaking my hair. I clipped my carabiner into the safety line I had pre-rigged along the eaves during the summer. I hoisted myself up onto the metal roof, my boots finding traction on the slick surface. The wind was punishing, trying to peel me off the slope. I moved with slow, methodical precision, reaching the dish mount near the chimney. I loosened the locking bolts, checking the compass heading on my watch. Adjusting the dish by fractions of an inch, I waited. Through the rain-streaked glass of the living room window, I saw Amelia staring up at me, her hands pressed against the glass. Her face was pale with worry. I gave the dish a final nudge. A second later, Amelia's face lit up. She knocked hard on the glass, giving me a thumbs up. I tightened the bolts, securing the alignment, and rappelled back down to the deck. When I walked back inside, shaking the water from my jacket, Amelia was standing right there in the mudroom. She held a clean towel in her hands. Without a word, she stepped into my personal space and draped the towel over my head, gently drying my hair. I froze. The sudden proximity, the scent of vanilla and rain on her skin was overwhelming. My hands stayed strictly at my sides. I didn't reach out. I didn't touch her waist. I maintained the distance out of absolute respect for her vulnerability in my home. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Her hands paused, the towel resting against the back of my neck. The transfer of stability was instantaneous. The tremor of her anxiety vanished, absorbed by my stillness. It's my job to maintain the comms, I replied, my voice raspy. She stepped back, her eyes searching mine. You're always doing that, taking the risk, fixing the problem, asking for nothing. I don't need anything, Amelia. It was a lie. I needed to pull her against me and block out the entire world, but I stayed perfectly still. On Friday morning, the sky finally cleared, a brittle, pale blue breaking through the gray. The county road crew radioed that the bridge was passable for high-clearance vehicles. We drove into the city in my truck. The silence in the cab was thick. We were heading toward the courthouse to meet her lawyer and officially file the injunction. The transition back to reality felt like a threat. When we walked into the sterile, marble-floored lobby of the county courthouse, Sterling Management's regional director was already there, speaking with a clerk. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a sharp suit and a smug expression. When he saw Amelia, he smirked. Ms. Daniels, I didn't think you'd make it down from the mountain. It's a shame about the flood. The cleanup crew is already prepping to clear out your lower level. Amelia stiffened beside me, her breath hitching. The social pressure was immediate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't puff out my chest. I simply stepped forward, sliding a thick manila folder onto the clerk's counter, right over the manager's paperwork. The cleanup crew will be trespassing, I stated cleanly, looking directly into the manager's eyes. This is a court-stamped injunction filed electronically at 8 a.m. this morning. Clause 4B is invalid without a structural engineer's assessment. My team secured the perimeter of her unit yesterday. If your crew touches the locks, it's a Class B misdemeanor for illegal eviction, and I have time-stamped video evidence of the property condition. The manager's smugness evaporated. He looked at the paperwork, then at me, then at Amelia. Who are you? I'm her logistics coordinator, I said smoothly, and as of this morning, I'm a witness. I stepped aside, leaving the space open for Amelia. I wouldn't fight her battles for her. I merely removed the unfair leverage so she could swing the sword. Amelia stepped up to the counter, her posture immaculate. You will have the keys to the temporary generator returned to my lawyer by noon, Richard, and you will cease all communication with me outside of certified mail. She turned on her heel and walked out of the courthouse. I followed her, a profound sense of pride settling in my chest. When we reached my truck in the parking garage, Amelia didn't get in immediately. She turned to face me. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving a quiet, terrifying vulnerability in its wake. "You didn't have to come with me," she said, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. "I wanted to," I replied simply. "I have to go back to the city now," she said, looking down at the concrete. "I have to find a temporary apartment while the injunction holds. I have to rebuild the client schedule." She was setting a timeline, a boundary to separate us because she didn't believe a man like me would want the messy reality of her life. "Amelia," I said. I reached out and gently grasped her hand. It wasn't a romantic stroke. It was an anchor, a transfer of stability. The world stopped spinning around us. "You don't have to do it alone." She looked up, her eyes wide. "Carter, I'm 36. I'm fighting a corporate eviction. I'm a mess. You're a hero. You fly into storms. You need someone who isn't a disaster area." "I don't want a hero's life," I said, my voice steady, locking her gaze. "I fly into storms because I have to. But when I come down, I want a quiet room. I want a home. The past 6 days, fixing the dish, reading the maps while you drafted emails, that was the first time that cabin felt like a home." She exhaled a shaky breath, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her cheek. "I don't know how to lean on someone without feeling like I'm falling." "Then don't fall," I said softly. "Just stand next to me." The climax wasn't a grand speech. It was a practical, terrifying decision. She looked at my truck, then at the city skyline, and finally back at me. "Take me back to the mountain," she whispered. The drive back was different. The heavy, protective silence was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. When we walked back into the cabin, the sun was streaming through the A-frame windows, illuminating the dust motes in the air. Amelia dropped her bag by the door. She walked into the living room, turned around, and asked the question that hung in the air like a finalized contract. "Is there room in your bed?" She wasn't asking for passion. She was asking for sanctuary. She was asking to drop the shield. I looked at her, standing in the center of my life, perfectly resilient and entirely mine to protect. I didn't rush forward. I closed the distance slowly, letting her see every step of my intent. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with a yearning I had disciplined into submission for a week. I stopped inches from her. "But do you want to stay with me forever?" She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the final inch of space, resting her forehead against my chest. The chaos of the world was physically blocked out. The sudden stillness settled over me, a heavy, grounding finality. I tilted her chin up and kissed her. It wasn't a frantic exploration. It was an arrival. It was the sealing of a promise, the dropping of an anchor after a lifetime at sea. It felt heavy, absolute, and safe. 2 weeks later, we stood in the office of a commercial real estate broker. Amelia was signing a new lease for a standalone studio space on the edge of the city. I stood right beside her, my hand resting on the back of her chair. "Initial here, Ms. Daniels," the broker said, sliding the final page forward. "And the secondary emergency contact?" Amelia took the pen. Without looking up, she wrote my name on the line. She handed the clipboard back, standing up and sliding her hand smoothly into mine in front of the broker. It was a public choice, a concrete action. I gripped her fingers. The transfer of stability, absolute. We walked out of the office together, the afternoon sun warming the Portland streets. Looking back now, I realized that true partnership isn't about rescuing someone from their life. It's about building a safe harbor so they can fight their own battles with a full heart. Love isn't about holding on tight to control the outcome. It's about knowing they will come back if you let go, because you've proven you are their safe place. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.